will be recorded and can be viewed later on our website and probably the websites of our sister organizations. It's a great pleasure to host a discussion about a very important new report called Embarking on a Path of Renewal. This report was prepared by the Commission on Stabilization and Growth in the Middle East and North Africa, and it's an honor to be partnered with the Economic Research Forum based in Cairo and Dr. Ibrahim al-Badawi, who's with us here today, partnering on this event, as well as partnering with the Finance for Development Lab, which is a Paris-based think tank with participants from all over the world, sort of a network of economic and finance experts focused on building a fairer international financial architecture and marshaling financial sort of thinking and policy towards sustainable and inclusive development. From that institution, Dr. Shat Diwan, who is the research director, is partnering for this event. Those two institutions partnered on the launch of this report. The session today will feature a quick presentation of the main findings and recommendations of the report by Drs. al-Badawi and Diwan, then a panel with esteemed colleagues from the World Bank and the IMF to discuss some of the economic and financial findings and recommendations, followed by a second panel looking beyond sort of the finance and macroeconomic issues. It gives MEI great pleasure to be hosting a lot of these economic and political economic conversations. Just 2 weeks ago, we hosted the launch of the World Bank's Middle East and North Africa Economic Update, and Dr. Roberta Gatti was with us there as well. And in September, we worked with UNDP to launch their new Arab Human Development Report. Obviously, politics, economic, social conditions are all greatly intertwined, and those discussions are necessarily interwoven. This report focuses on the urgent plight of a number of countries in the region which are in particular distress, and focuses on what can be done to assist them moving forward, both in the fiscal space, but also in some kind of economic recovery after the multiple shocks of COVID-19, of energy prices, food prices, slowdown in global economy, focus on conditions in Egypt and Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, Sudan, and Tunisia in particular. So I'm eager to get started. Let me invite to the podium Dr. al-Badawi for his remarks and some slides from the presentation, and then Dr. Shat Diwan. Dr. Ibrahim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's really a pleasure to be here at the Middle East Institute, and we're very grateful for the opportunity to present our joint report, the Economic Research Forum and the Finance for Development Lab. This committee was constituted with the key objective of promoting the debate about the future of development for the MENA region, both from the perspective of the riskiness that entails development in the region, given the challenges we have, but then also the report and the mandate of the Commission is aimed at providing prospects, providing an opportunity to be hopeful in terms of the ability of the region to overcome the challenges and also to partake in the future of the phenomenal transformation that is happening in terms of technology, and also to be responsive to the social agenda and the environmental agenda in terms of the sustainability of the growth program. The report, which we'll present today, will be actually will give a kind of a regional perspective focusing on the big issues, but then it will also motivate detailed case studies that will be developed in the individual countries by leading researchers and policymakers former policymakers from these regions. And I would like also to extend our thanks and appreciation to the IDRC, the Canadian IDRC, for supporting this project and for actually engaging with us in a very productive way and useful way in terms of the future development issues and concerns for the region. The terms of reference for the Commission was to threefold. Was, as I said, to assess how risky is the current development path in MENA, especially in the highly indebted 4 countries of the region, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, and Tunisia, in addition to other 2 countries, Lebanon and Sudan, which are additionally also facing some other challenges, because the political order in these 2 countries are being challenged, in addition, of course, to themselves being having to face some very serious risks. Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you. So they move up. Okay. Yeah. So this is the first fundamental issue about the macro stabilization and the issues associated with the debt. And then the question is how to avoid financial crises and recessions and initiate and sustain inclusive and more sustainable growth, emphasizing the importance of growth. And then the third fundamental issue, what reforms are needed? Debt workouts and stabilization measures, innovative economic, social, and climate-related structural reforms, and improvement in governance and state capacity. 2 fundamental features, I already mentioned one of them, is that the Commission was tasked with the responsibility and expected not to shy away from addressing the political choices that confront the MENA societies, because realistically, actually, reforms is deeply political issue and requires confronting these issues, openly and transparently and objectively. And of course, as I just said, this report will be followed by in-depth case studies. The Commission itself is composed of leading researchers and policymakers from the 6 countries. And very quickly, I'll mention Nisreen Barakat and Omar Razaz from Jordan, Leila Baghdadi and Mustafa Nabli from Tunisia, Ishaq Dewan and Maha Yahya from Lebanon, Nada Isa and Ibrahim Al-Badawi from Sudan, Alia Mahdi and Mahmoud Muhiddin from Egypt, and then Karim Al-Innawi from Morocco. And all of these people are heavily involved in the research, the policy debate and discussions in their respective countries, as well as, of course, they are leading contributors to the ERF network and FDL as well. There are 4 key messages that I would like to briefly highlight. The first key message is that the current path will definitely lead to financial crisis if not addressed. However, austerity-only adjustment will lead to social crisis. So there is an important message here that austerity without growth is very risky from the perspective of the social and political stability. The second message is that IMF program, and we're happy, of course, to have Jihad with us here, as well as Dr. Masoud Ahmed as well. And hopefully they will say something about this. So the IMF programs is very important. That work out will be an important task for them, but they are not likely to be sufficient. We need a national renewal plan, credible enough to ignite growth. Ishaq will hopefully find time to elaborate a little bit more on this. The third message is considerable growth potential exists, which is this is a hopeful and an inspiring message of the report that that there is need for a pro-growth macro, need for modernizing the state, democratizing the private sector and the private sector market, and also there's huge potential of deploying the digital technology and other advances in the high-tech revolution to not only to deal with growth, to promote growth, but also to use it as a medium for cash transfers and other social services and so on. But then also there is potential for dealing with global warming and deglobalization and regionalism. But my understanding, or our understanding, is not really like closing the economy, but ensuring that also there are indigenous capabilities through reshoring, through rehabilitation of global value chains at the regional level, which entails rethinking the regional cooperation to support the national development agenda. Finally, the fourth message is that economic reforms are eminently political, as we said. We need to entice opposition and engage them and mobilize support and to generate trust and confidence in the future. And this obviously is a very important aspect because it requires that there will be some sort of a deliberative, cross-filterizing engagement with various elements in society, especially the three fundamental agents or actors, the political elites, the private sector, and of course, the civil society and the population at large. So let me now turn over the floor to Ishaq, who is going to start by giving an overall diagnostics and then elaborate on these key messages.
Thank you. Thank you, Brahim, and thanks to the MEI for the invitation to speak here, and to all the members of the panel. I think this promises to be a very interesting session. There's lots of reports on the Middle East, on the problems, on some of the solutions, on how to deal with fiscal issues, particular growth issues. There are beautiful reports that came up this year here from the World Bank, from the IMF. There are some regional reports as well. So one question is, why another report? And as Ibrahim said, we've asked the Commission members to speak with brutal honesty about the very grave situation in which the oil importers are now, an unprecedented grave situation that we haven't seen really since the 70s or so, that risks bringing at least the oil importer countries decades back if the situation is not addressed in a forceful manner. And so besides the brutal honesty, the group wanted to really come up with homegrown aspirations for what is possible, focusing a lot on the political constraints and the political courage that is needed to push for good change. And so the main messages, as you said, that I will elaborate a little bit on, not much, is that not doing anything risks a very grave financial crisis. Dealing with the shocks simply by tightening our belts will lead to most likely to a very grave social crisis because it's not that little shock that is the problem, but rather old problems that have festered, that haven't been taken care of, and new challenges that must be addressed. And that therefore growth is possible, as you said, and growth is needed and is the only way out over time, out of that crisis. It's of course good for its own sake as well. And it's possible. There are growth opportunities right now. And finally, that moving in this direction is an eminently political act. And politicians' role is not simply to maintain the security and to live for another year, but the time has come really to stop pushing the can down the road and to make it their main role really to be able to move these economies and the citizens towards fulfilling their full potential and avoiding the grave risks ahead. So I simply want to magnify some of those messages. You see the report is short and easy to read and is now on all the websites. You see here the Lebanon and Sudan debt to GDP over time has shot up to over 100%, 150% of GDP. The two countries are in a very grave financial crisis. And the challenge for the other countries, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, and Tunisia, that are seeing the same movements in their debt to GDP ratio since really the 2010, after improvement before that, inexorably rising curves, and then getting a little bit worse in the last few years with COVID and this current year with the tightness coming from the global market, from fuel and food prices as well. And so a constant deterioration due in part to an easy fiscal, dealing with the tough years after the Arab Spring by expanding fiscally, and also to a large extent by bad debt dynamics. That is no growth, very little growth in the 2010s, while interest rates are rising slowly on domestic debt in particular. So bad debt dynamics and an easy fiscal policy to deal with social problems leading towards a point where this will not be possible. It will not be possible to manage a tough social situation by simply spending, and other solutions have to be thought about to avoid the risks, which are the debt service, increasingly squeezing on expenditure. At some point, the reliance on refinancing the debt through the capital market will not be possible. There will be a sudden stop, as happened in Lebanon, which would lead to, we're already seeing pressures on the exchange rate, on interest rate, much more of that, and therefore leading to an economic squeeze that will generate more unemployment and more poverty, as we're seeing vividly in Lebanon and in Sudan. And so a bit more technically, and I'm sure Jihad will talk about that, the debt sustainability analysis, as you see, has a lot of red. We've looked at three scenarios. One, which is the old IMF scenario, which is being updated now. A second one, a historical scenario. If historical trends of the past 10 years continue, what happens? Lots of red. The debt ratios go over 100% of GDP, which is massive and unsustainable. And if you add the new shocks, even more red. Morocco looks a little bit better in the between 80 and 100% of GDP, still a high risk, but the other countries move a lot into debt distress. Now, and we will hear from Jihad Azzour, to have a sustainable situation, you would need to either produce large fiscal surpluses, and so one would have to imagine moving from deficits to surpluses with a movement of at least 5% of GDP, which is very tough socially to stabilize the situation, or else to increase the growth rates by 2-3% of GDP to move from 2% to 4-5% growth a year, or a combination of both. I think what happened to Lebanon should really keep us on our toes and keep all the countries on their toes. Avoiding the crisis is very important. Lebanon has done very little to avoid the crisis. They have worked on their fiscal surpluses. So the fiscal wasn't in deficit, but after 2010, growth collapsed And so the debt dynamics were very negative. Growth next to zero, interest rates rising, and that leads to a deterioration over time. They should have really devalued, focused on the growth strategy, even at the risk of having to reduce the debt much earlier to put the country on a path to growth and sustainability. And the lessons is to for the other countries to do that and not to fall into a crisis, because you see on the right how tough it is when you are in a crisis to avoid the fight over who's going to take the losses. 3 years after the crisis in Lebanon, there's no agreement on how to share the losses. The banking system is collapsed, doesn't work. There's still capital flight, multiple exchange rate, and the state doesn't function anymore. And we are very far from being able to think of finding a growth path. The situation is similar in Sudan as well. The rebuilding after this destruction is extremely difficult, so very important to avoid. In terms of messages, we'd love to hear from the IMF on debt. I mean, in other countries, part of the burden of adjustment is on the creditors. It seems quite hard in the region to do that. When you look at the structure of debt, a lot of it is domestic, more in some countries than in other. In Egypt, is very domestic. There's only so much you could do domestically without hurting too much the banking sector and falling into a Lebanese deep crisis, if you like. The external, a lot of the external debt is with multilaterals that do not take haircuts, in Tunisia in particular. The bilateral is not very high, and the commercial debt is there and will put a lot of pressure, and it's expensive, but it's not terribly high either. So it's clear that at some point, some workout will be needed, but it will be difficult to do and will not bring a lot of gains. And so it poses the question of how to bring new finance, really, to get growth going again, as we will discuss. And we will argue that you need actually very courageous movement on a pro-growth agenda in order to clean up this and be able to attract new finance. But most importantly, I think our key message is the main difference will have to be made by domestic efforts. The saving rates are among the lowest in the world in our region by now. The labor force participation is among the lowest in the world. The tax revenues are very low. The environment has been such that nobody gains by putting efforts, innovate, work hard. And this would be really the first thing to get a movement towards embarking on a new growth path, is to increase, is to decide and agree to work harder for this better future. The second message is, I mean, the core message, therefore, is that inaction will lead to crisis, but austerity alone, this 5% movement, will be super destabilizing from a social perspective because of two reasons. We've had 10 years of social aspirations and demands and riots that were stopped by COVID, but could come back any moment. And more importantly, the social situation is very poor, poverty has risen, unemployment is very high. And to keep tightening one's belt without seeing the end of the tunnel, especially prone to a situation of despair. So the goal of a growth strategy is also to bring back hope so that one accepts a short-term sacrifice for some gains in the future. And so we say growth is the only solution, and the fear is really of a vicious cycle otherwise. So on IMF support, absolutely necessary, but since we're in Washington, the question really for us is how to have a broader national program that the IMF and the World Bank can support, that focuses on stabilization and growth and manages to be generous and attract funding for this new strategy, but with tighter conditionality, so that we're not pushing the can down the road for another year or 2 years, but really starting to deal very seriously with the situation. So the three pillars of such a strategy are clearly, some fiscal adjustment is necessary. We're not saying no austerity. We're saying an austerity only strategy is not the right one. But part of the strategy got to be to cut expenditure and to move expenditure to the right lines, most importantly. Secondly, to ignite growth. And thirdly, to muster the political will to do it. This table shows you what's possible. I mean, you have the growth rates in the 2000s, in the first column, which you could compare to the growth rate in the last decade. They are less than half. So growth has collapsed. And part of the reason, the important part, is total investment has collapsed. Partly public investment because of budget constraint, but also private investment, which is at the lowest we've literally ever seen it in Egypt and in Jordan and in Tunisia as well. So the confidence in the economy, the will to invest is also very, very much down. And so a big push is needed to change private sector expectations so that they have hope in the future. Now, I need to go a little faster on expenditure. Nothing really to add to the great reports that we have. You have to cut expenditure, and you have mostly to shift them to something else. Now, in terms of cutting the fat, there is fat, and it's going to take political courage to reduce that fat, because there are veto players that either push for very high public sector wages in Tunisia, or that push for high interest rate and domestic debt service in Egypt, or a middle class urban that push for high subsidies because they don't trust that the state can spend the money better in many countries. And so cutting deeply into these expenditure must be part of a political deal to spend on something else. I mean, it's important to muster, if you like, support from those that can gain from reform and consolidate that support in order to be able to deal with these veto players. So many new needs that are needed on the right-hand side, that improving investment in human capital, absolutely central, investment in infrastructure, tackle climate change, absolutely central, new challenge, and across the board, improving the efficiency of expenditure, and in particular by using new technologies much better, especially digital technologies. Now, on growth, obviously there are some short-term measures to take to ignite growth, such as stabilizing the macro, devaluations, the kind of things the IMF is very good at monitoring and defining. But very important to realize that alone doesn't do it. I mean, in 2016, Egypt devalued its currency by 50%, yet there was no supply response. Export barely moved up and then stabilized. The private sector basically didn't believe that this devaluation will improve their competitiveness sufficiently and over time to push them to invest. So that alone doesn't lead to a shift in expectation. And what you need is to put together a medium-term plan that would unfold over time, that deals with all challenges, democratizing the private sector, modernizing the state, new challenges, opening up to digitalization, dealing with climate change, going more into regional cooperation. That takes time, but you need to change the narrative sufficiently to shift expectations so that people believe that this will happen and they start reacting today, which is needed to make it happen. And you need citizens to start getting trust in the future again, so that they accept sacrifice, they start collaborating, coordinating more. The private sector to start investing a little bit more and reversing the trends that we've seen, and to also attract capital from abroad, because this is needed. And the report also contained this positive message about the existence of growth opportunities. I mean, all the commissioners see the region as way below potential. It can do much better. Now, we can list the area. The private sector can do much better. The public services, health, education can modernize, and that can create jobs and jobs for small firms. Digitalization can improve productivity across the board. The relocalization of value chains to Europe create new opportunities in North Africa. Climate adaptation, if that is to be 2, 3, 4% of GDP, that lots of jobs, if it can be financed externally. regional cooperation. Now, we have no blueprints about how to do that. And I think Mustafa will talk about the difficulty of telling the decision makers what to do. They got to figure out the process of discovery. The point as potentially exists. How to implement it is not written on anybody's page. It has to be discovered by these societies. Finally, to close, the core message, I think, is that this is politicians' job, is to find this path to renewal. They could not just listen to their security people telling them, you know, for stability's sake, don't do anything, don't rock the boat. The boat has reached, is about to hit an iceberg. And you got to take political risk on what matter, which is a path of renewal, reaching the potential of these societies. So it involves political change. Now, political liberalization is obviously good for its own sake, first and foremost, but justice and human rights and liberty to speak out is crucial for good functioning of the economy as well. And, you know, without civil society that can criticize different plans, you know, sooner or later you'll hit, you know, big white elephants that, as we see in some countries. You cannot really, without mobilizing society, build the political force to neutralize the veto players that are not allowing you to actually move forward. And probably the way to do it is also to find ways to experiment and then scale up what works. To conclude, commissioners were very interested in regional cooperation, not the old style Arab League, but all the new areas that really transcend borders, where you can have win-win by working across the region. The internet, the Arabic language barely exists on the internet. Climate doesn't have borders. Agricultural security, food security is again an issue that where Sudan and others can benefit, rivers and others. And other programs. So just to conclude, this report is not a blueprint, is aspirational. And it's meant to open up debates in society so that there is more effort into thinking about the risks ahead and what else can be done, but also to mobilize the region to have more voice in the international debates that are now shaping the new rules. And we'd love to hear later Masoud talk about that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Diwan, and I'll invite the panel and Dr. Ibrahim and Dr. Ishaq to join us on the podium here. Yes, all microphones on, green lights. Well, thank you, Dr. Ibrahim and Dr. Ishaq, for presenting the report. I'm sure many people have already read as much as they could of it, or those people online either have or will read it after the session. There's a lot of material there, but thank you for presenting the main points. We have two panelists to join us in conversation from the World Bank, Dr. Roberta Gatti. She's the chief economist of the Middle East and North Africa region at the World Bank. And 2 weeks ago, with you and your colleagues, launched the World Bank's report. And I know you want to comment a bit about the interconnectivity between the findings there and the findings and recommendations of this report. We're also joined by our friend, Dr. Jihad Azrour, the director of the Middle East and Central Asia Department at the IMF. The IMF has been mentioned a lot in this presentation and report, and I'm sure Jihad has a lot to say. Let me start with you, Roberta. There's a lot of findings and recommendations in the report as I was reading this and recalling the report that you yourself and the team at the bank launched. There's a lot of interconnectivity between the necessity for reform, necessity of going beyond the usual methods. But give us your top line reactions and thoughts on this report and how it relates to the bank's work.
Thank you, Paul, for having me here, and many congratulations to Dr. Ibrahim and Dr. Ishaq and the whole commission for a frank and really thoughtful report. It shows that it's been written by people who understand the region deeply and love it. And on top of it all, it's even short. So I really recommend that anyone who's interested in understanding the challenges of the region reads it. Now, we were here 2 weeks ago to discuss the current outlook for the region and how it connects to the pre-existing vulnerabilities of the region. So let me just say 3 things about the current outlook. So this is a year where the region is actually growing quite strongly at 5.5% is the fastest growth rate since 2016. But what we see, it's a bifurcated growth. And the bifurcation happens because of oil prices, and oil exporting countries are growing very strongly, while the prospect of oil importing countries, if we look at the change in expectations for the growth forecast, have been worsening over time. Why so? Because of these two sort of big trends that have happened due to these overlapping crises, the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, the increase in oil prices and the increase in food prices. Now, oil prices benefit some, so we see this unevenness across the region, but higher food prices are detrimental to all because our countries are food importers. Now, we all worry about inflation because we know it's a regressive tax. And if we look at the distribution of expenditure of different percentile of population in countries, up to 60% of the spending of the poor is for energy and food. So this is something that worries everybody a lot, and it's really hard, strongly felt, particularly by the poor. The MENA region has been doing quite well in terms of controlling inflation. For example, in Egypt, inflation now is 15%, which is high, but we computed that it could be counterfactually higher by the tune of 4 percentage points. And this 4 percentage point in inflation that have been sort of kept away are the result of policies that are a tradition in the region. And Dr. Ishaq was talking about fuel subsidies, food subsidies, product market interventions, which we know are effective now, but are very costly and bring all sorts of distortions in the economy. If we talk about fiscal costs, the third part that is of worry, and we've seen these graphs in the presentation of the Commission, is the dynamic of public debt. We know that Lebanon is already in default, but oil importing countries, which were the focus of the Commission, are seeing complicated times ahead. Just to give you a statistics, in Egypt, the interest rate expenditure to service the debt is half of the revenues that are collected by the state. So when Dr. Ishaq was talking about that, private investment isn't happening, public expenditure isn't really supporting long-term growth. If you think that half of your revenues goes to service the debt, it becomes almost immediate that you see that type of displacement. Now, what we see now in oil importing countries is the product not only of the shocks today, but also vulnerabilities that have accumulated over time. And if we think about growth in the past 20 years, just the back of the envelope calculation shows that countries in the region would be up to 30% richer in terms of GDP per capita had they grown at the median rate of growth of a middle-income country in the world. So it is true that this is a region that, with its beauty, culture, and potential, lives inside that frontier of potential. And I'd like to conclude this first round of my side by thinking about some of the recommendations of the Commission, which are, I think, for me, very sensible and very thoughtful. Something that I would add there is not only to think about promoting growth through the accumulation of human capital, through more labor force participation and investment, so through the accumulation of factors, but by changing I'm thinking about the solo model, and I'm thinking about the part of institutional improvement that is needed to make this machinery move from a low growth equilibrium to a better equilibrium for everyone. So let me stop here, and I'm happy to elaborate more.
Well, thank you very much, Roberta. That's a very sort of rich response and initial sort of comments. Let me turn to Jihad, Dr. Azour. Thoughts from the report? Obviously, the IMF is already transforming a lot of what it does. What are your top line thoughts from the report's findings and recommendations?
Well, thank you very much. And I would like to also congratulate the team for an excellent report. The recommendations of the report converges very well with fund thinking and what the fund is trying to do. Let me maybe start by where do we stand? I think the selection of the countries is relevant, but there are other countries that also deserve attention. Some of those countries who are in conflict and fragile situation. I think this is a group of countries that is also facing an important challenges, and talking about MENA, especially on the oil importing side, would require us also to integrate those. On the context, I think we also seeing that the succession of shocks have increased the level of vulnerability that is not currently translated in the top line numbers, i.e. growth. Of course, we saw during COVID that fragility of economic systems have widened. And to illustrate that, I would take two examples. For informality used to be usually the first line of defense whenever you have a shock. In this crisis, informality was not, at the contrary, in fact, penalized the capacity to respond. Two, the level of unemployment, which was already an issue, went up, and women participation declined because of the nature of the COVID crisis. When you add to that, that recently with the increase in inflation, that is mainly headline inflation, food and fuel, this is also having additional strong impact. Compounded with that is the change in the course of capital flows. In the last 10 years, when you look at the situation in the region, the massive part of capital flows were portfolio flows, less FDIs compared to the first decade of the century. Now we see a reversal of capital flows, which will reflect in not only increase in interest rates, but also in the capacity to refinance. Therefore, I would add those elements in order to show that, yes, definitely, it's very important to move and to move now. This is on the context. What needs to be done? I think we are all converging on the pillars. Let me start maybe with the policies. On the fiscal side, clearly, consolidation doesn't mean austerity. You can have growth, inclusive, friendly consolidation. And I want to stress on that because this is an element that I would like the team to reflect more on, is how to use tax policy. Recently, we issued a report that shows that progressivity in tax system is achievable. Eliminating some of the loopholes that exist will increase revenues and increase equity. Equity, and this is something that is also one of the political dimension in any society and any social contract, is the tax system. I would encourage very much the team to reflect more on that. On the expenditure side, here again, recently we did two studies that are, I think, interesting to compare or to share the results. Social spending is 2% of GDP. Subsidies in most of the countries is between 4 and 5 to 6% of GDP. Subsidy has proven to be very regressive. Therefore, resorting currently to subsidies in order to address, it may have a very short-lived impact, but this is definitely not the right approach on the fiscal side. However, what COVID showed us that we can improve our social protection system. Using technology in many countries have been effective. What needs to be done? The problem is a problem of data. We don't have updated household surveys. Therefore, we need to improve on that. We need to share those household surveys in order to have a better targeting. Therefore, fiscal provides more flexibility than we think. And we recently issued a book on inclusive growth that addresses those different dimensions. Therefore, I would encourage us to think beyond the classical ways of looking at both expenditure side and revenue side. But fiscal is not only a flow issue, it's a balance sheet issue. And this is where the SOE's reform is very important. Also here, one headline number to illustrate. The fiscal cost on average is more than 2.5% of GDP, higher than what we spend on social. Our study showed that this is not only an issue of fiscal transfer, but also of leveling the playing field and utilization of resources. And also the balance sheet of the state carries a lot of contingent liabilities that when the wind changes becomes really an issue. Therefore, I also encourage all of us to look at how to reform the SOE system, not only to reduce their fiscal dependence and to improve their reliability, but also as a way to open up growth potential. Because we are all talking about growth and we need to find ways to do this. This is also leads me to one of the issues that in the last 10 years we were facing. Deficit went up because expenditure went up. But when you look at the composition of expenditures, did not go in where expenditure should go. When the wage bill increased, in fact, prevented many who needed the social support to get it. It eroded education, it eroded spending on health. And during COVID, we paid the price for it. Therefore, I think it's very important also to, and this is highly political, to have the courage to say those reforms require political capital and need to be made. Therefore, on the how, this is on the fiscal. But again, some of those countries have been subjected to external shocks. And here the monetary policy has to play. When I heard devaluation in Egypt, in fact, we moved to a flexible exchange rate. And the flexible exchange rate required to have a monetary policy that used the monetary policy tool. Therefore, I think we have to move from fiscal only to use all the tools of macroeconomic policies. Fiscal, financial, monetary, as well as also real. On the financial, one of the issues that the region is facing is access to finance, that is limiting inclusion. On average, access to finance is between 3 to 4%, when in emerging economies is around 14 to 17%. Bringing this level to comparable levels is in itself will bring huge inflows to the system and compensate for the crowding out, especially that recently we see that the nexus between state and the financial sector has increased, i.e. the financial sector is now holding more and more public debt. Reducing issues that require some, integrated policies. Women's participation is really an issue. If we only reduce the cap by 50%, we have windfall of more than $1 trillion in the next 10 years. Therefore, I would encourage us to look at policies in broader perspective, see how they integrate, understand that those policies to work need to have capacity and need to be well communicated. I think this is also one of the issues that we are all facing and faced in the past. Who should do it? Let me start with us. The program of the fund, the programs of fund are short-term in nature. And usually they attract the reader for their fiscal side, not for their structural side. If we take the case of Jordan, Egypt, Tunisia, there are a lot of important structural reforms that were introduced, including on the social transfer, takaful and karama, all the shift in the subsidy utilization to be more targeted. This is part of the program. To have specific measures, for example, related to women's participation, those are issues that are in the program. But unfortunately, all the focus is on the short-term stabilization and much less on the transformative dimension of our programs. The second issue that we have in our programs, our programs are between 3 and 4 years. The transformation requires a couple of decades. Therefore, whenever you stop a program, those moments between programs or when you end a program, you have a risk of unwinding some of the efforts that were needed but not yet completed. And therefore, this is where the role of integrated approach between institutions through a medium-term aspirational contracts, economic and social transformation contracts are important. And this is where the dialogue with the broader community is very important. And also we have to confess, but that there are external shocks. Take the case of Tunisia. In 2014, Tunisia was subjected to a certain number of security shocks that affected the situation there. Therefore, I think this is an important thing. And we did a retrospection on our programs. And we identified certain number of issues in terms of our assumptions, in terms of the duration of programs, etc. Now, in certain important dimensions, we're moving to a longer term programs to address issue of resilience and sustainability. But I think what we need is a more framework approach and a better donor coordination and better coordination between what institutions could do, bilateral do, and the private sector can do. Therefore, this is on who. There is another dimension of the who that is very important. Currently, we are at the point where if we move too little, too late, we will repeat something that happened in the past. The urgency of the moment is not reflected in the numbers, but for those who know the region well, know that this is a moment that requires special attention. And we urge decision makers to look at, how to not lose opportunity now, use the resources that are maybe scarce, but to move very quickly. Last point, which is mentioned and had, I would say, special feature in the report, which is debt. I think the countries we have here are in different nature. We have two countries who are already in debt restructuring, Sudan and Lebanon. Sudan is in the HIPC process. Lebanon is in somewhere in between, agreeing on the policies and moving into the action. While others are in different situations, and their debt is different. All of them has a debt issue, but dealing with it requires different instruments and different policies. And this is where I think it's very important to take them case by case. Yet there are certain number of important elements. Fiscal is not enough. Confidence now plays an important role in order to allow the fiscal dominance and therefore allow for a wider range of sources of financing. Two, the regional cooperation is very important. We see interest in providing assistance and support. And I would say that gradually the integration or the coordination between bilateral and what the multilaterals are providing, including us as a fund, has improved. We need to strengthen this framework. And also we need to make sure that it is a reform-based. Of course, each shock requires a different solution. In 2020, when we provided immediate support, we provided it because countries needed it immediately, and therefore it was not attached to conditions. When you need to help countries in their transformation, you need to support reforms and to put weight behind those reforms. Last but not the least, how to innovate. Innovation takes different forms, and the fund is trying. I would say this is a big move. We have moved with the RST initiative to longer-term financing, which is something that is not in the culture of the institution, but also we did not only respond during COVID with an immediate assistance. Now also we have a food security initiative also to address the immediate impact. Some would raise the valid question. If you don't put certain number, or if you don't promote certain number of reforms, what you provide as assistance could delay those reforms. It's a very valid question. And I think this is where we need to have maybe, like we are trying to do with our conflict and fragile states, a kind of a medium-term collaboration framework. We need maybe to mainstream this also with other countries, whereby the relationship or the coordination or the cooperation goes beyond programs. I'll stop here because
Thank
I
you.
see that you brought your mic up.
I brought my mic up, yes. We are running extremely short of time. I didn't want to interrupt anybody because everything that is being presented here is of such great value, very insightful, and resonates very well with the findings and recommendations of the report, but I'm very well aware of time. We do want to move on to our next panel, since we still have basically 30 minutes of this session. But I did want to turn, if you have any final comments or remarks, Dr. Brahim or Dr. Sha, from what you've heard from the World Bank and the IMF briefly, before we turn to the last panel. Also, Roberta, if you have any comments, and I see from your face that you do. Let me turn to Sha and Brahim first, and then Roberta. I'm afraid we might not have time for audience questions, but you can catch our speakers here in the hallways and ask them. Dr. Brahim, any thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Paul. I think this is, these are very thoughtful and relevant responses from both Roberta and Jihad. And I think this should be a start of a conversation with the scholars and policymakers in the region along these lines. And I'm particularly impressed by the idea that the IMF should be thinking about broadening the engagement beyond the particular program of adjustment. I think that's very important. And I know already the World Bank is, of course, is much more tuned to this idea, given the wider engagement of the World Bank with the region.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, I mean, this is music to our ears. I think that the pieces of the puzzle are well understood, and the institutions are doing their job very well. What is missing is a social debate in the countries. It's the thoughtful discussion in the country, which you could help with much more brutal honesty. I mean, you speak of the gravity of the situation, but your documents don't speak so much, don't ring the alarm sufficiently, given the actual gravity of the situation. And civil society, the private sector need to really get mobilized to be able to play their role. And their role may well be to tell you, we need much harder conditionality. We need to really mobilize the political elites into doing what they need to do and not focus only on myopic short-term security, because this is taking us, like it took Lebanon, into the war. And how to avoid that war. So I know the IMF, the World Bank keeps calling for this social debate, but hopefully the mobilization will also come from the region, and this is really our part of our job.
It takes two
Thank
to
you.
tango.
Exactly.
Thank you, Sha. Two to tango. We have 4 here, so it's complicated. Roberta, final thoughts or comments from this panel?
Final thought on, we heard a lot on the what needs to be done and also on the who. And what I wanted to add as a final comment to this excellent conversation was on the how. And I wanted to build on what Dr. Ishaq was saying, which is we need to have more debate, and the state, which is so important now in moments of uncertainty and multiple shocks, needs to have measures for how it is doing well or how it is not doing well, and align the incentives to be accountable, to be able to change things over time. In our report, we call it the learning state. But just to give a simple example, and I'm going back to what Dr. Jihad was saying, our countries have very limited data access. That's the one dimension on which statistical offices, which have very significant technical capacity, fall short. Having more data access would be one way for the state and the civil society to be able to measure what we, the state and multilateral institutions do, and to be able to adjust. And so here I wanted to conclude with a word of being humble. We sort of know that some policy directions are important, but with these multiple shocks and increased uncertainty, it's very important to sort of measure along the way and make sense of where we land. And that's also where we could have more debate within the society, more homegrown, through that more transparency and accountability. We call it a learning state. I hope this is going to be one how in which these important policies then get started.
Fantastic. I want to thank Dr. Roberta Gatti, Jihad Azzour, Sha Diwan, Brahim Al-Badawi for everything they're doing in their various institutions, but for this very rich panel. I'd like to invite the members of the next panel, Dr. Mustafa Nabli, Dr. Hanan Mursi, Dr. Masoud Ahmed. The panel will be chaired by our good friend Sha Diwan. Please stay tuned.
Mustafa and Masoud, if I may, to expand a little bit in various directions into this first panel and in crucial directions. I think let's have a conversation on 3 points. I think it'd be really good to hear from Mustafa first, perhaps, about the equation that our rulers have in their head between stability short term and potential long term, and how could that arithmetic possibly change? Then we'll move to Hanan on how to attract finance, because we need to finance all this. And then I'd love Masoud to bring this to the global agenda. How can the global agenda help, and how can the region participate in the global conversation in ways that are helpful? So let's build on that. But let's start with you, Mustafa. How can this calculus change?
Thank you, Ishaq. I think I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to go through the tour. And I'm going to make a comment on jihad, what Jihad just said. I think what he said is very important, and I think the messages are clear, are strong. Unfortunately, the practice is not there. The Commission, one of the messages of the Commission is the need for a social dialogue, domestic social dialogue, which maps out the choices, maps out the medium term, and so on. Unfortunately, the way the IMF programs are done is completely different. The way the IMF programs, as today, what they are being done in Tunisia, in Morocco, in Egypt, and so on, they are done in dark rooms. There's no information about that. There is no debate about these programs. I speak for Tunisia, which I'm following somewhat, not that much, because I don't have information. Actually, there is very little information about what's going on. There is no debate about the issues. There is no domestic debate. The only debate is the IMF going to help or not help? Is it going to support or not support? And you have views on that. There is debate for and against, obviously, but on the content itself, on the choices, on what are we trying to achieve, there is very little known, very little we can discuss about. So this, I think, makes it very difficult to map out the medium term that Jihad was so much concerned about the structural reforms that are needed, that go beyond stabilization. There's very little of that discussion. So, so this leads me to answer your question in a way, because it's related to that. I think the Commission view, and I think there is consensus on that, is, okay, we need, which is a very appealing proposition for policymakers, for politicians, not policymakers, let me politicians as such. The option today for countries which are on the brink of financial crisis is have as little as possible of austerity to achieve stabilization, and as much as possible of structural reforms to stimulate growth. That's a winning proposition for policymakers, actually. It's a very attractive one. And you ask yourself, okay, if this is the case, if it's a macro proposition, why does it resonate with the politicians. Why politicians don't take it, don't grab it and run with it? Why don't they do it? And so you ask yourself, why this contradiction, if you like? The politics, the political solution, actually the political package is very clear and very attractive, but it's not taken, actually. Policymakers try first to avoid austerity at any cost. They don't want. And they don't want to talk about structural reforms as much. Structural reforms to deal with the fiscal problems that Jihad was talking about, or to deal with the growth problems that we are talking about as well. And the question is why? I'm asking myself this question exactly. Why is this so? Actually, it turns out from policymakers' point of view that austerity is more attractive than structural reforms, because austerity is easy to understand. You can get the results very quickly. You cut expenditures, you solve this problems, you cut wage bill if you can, and you cut this, and you cut subsidies if you can, as much as you can, and so on. But structural reforms are very uncertain, actually. Policymakers don't see the link between structural reforms and growth, actually. It's very difficult to sell a proposition that if you do these structural reforms, this 1, 2, 3, 4, then you are going to get, after so much time, so much growth. We don't have that information. I think as economists, actually, and international organizations, by the way, all of this, including you, Hanan, here, actually, we don't have very little practical knowledge to sell to the policymakers on the link between reforms and growth. We have some idea, we know that structural reforms eventually will produce growth. We know that, okay. But how much and when, we don't know. We have very little knowledge about that. And we, as economists, we have been failing to provide that, that argument, that thing that can motivate and make policymakers grab the package and run with it. Policymakers are risk averse. They don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to create disturbances for the system. So status quo is the preferred solution. So if they want to do structural reforms, they are disruptive structural reforms. They're costly, and they don't know what they will produce, how will it affect the political equilibrium, actually. And in addition to that, they don't know when they will get the benefits. Maybe after their term, if they're elected, democratically. But if they are not elected democratically, maybe it will be the cause of their, being kind of taken out of power. Right. So I think, my call here, my message, I will stop because we don't have much time, is something to us as economists and to international organizations, is really to think about that. It's not enough. We have to stop talking about do this, do that, do structural reform, do this, do that, and then and you don't provide the evidence that they're going to get the benefits that you are telling them they will get and when they will get them. Unless we do that, unless we improve our knowledge, I think we are going to be missing the boat, and we are going to be losing on the losing side. Policymakers are not going to follow us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mustafa. I made a big mistake. Share here. I didn't introduce you. I don't have your CV in my head, but the first time we met, you were Minister of the Economy, I believe, in Tunisia a long time ago.
Planning, yeah.
Planning. And then you were Chief Economist for the Middle East region at the World Bank, the next time I met you, I think. Yeah. And now you are in Tunisia. You were recently head of the Central Bank. You're very involved in domestic debate. You wrote a book and a second book. You ran for presidency. You want to change that country. And I know that Jihad too keeps calling for social debates. Policy is risky all over the world. So I think if we get to a second round, I want to ask you, how come the political parties don't put pressure on politicians, on the ruling regimes, to focus on the economy and to innovate? So let's try to get to a second round. Hanan Morsi We met, you were at the EBRD. I know you were before at the IMF. Then we met through Zoom several times. You were high up at the African Development Bank. And now you are in Addis Ababa, very high up, very close to the top of the UNECA. And so you're focusing very much now on African issues and on debt problems in particular. So when you look at the debt issues that we talked about a little bit here, and then we ask ourselves, we need actually capital flows to get these economies closer to their potential. And of course, as Roberta said, much more efficiency in the use of capital. So how do you see potential progress given this complicated balance sheet?
Thank you. Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. I think perhaps let me start by the context where we got here, and the context of how we got to the debt levels that we arrived at is actually a global context that was actually characterized by very low, historically low interest rates. And also at a time that there was the Arab Spring in the region. There was a lot of socio-economic pressures. So all this basically led to the build-up of debt. Meanwhile, the current global context have really changed massively. Now we have a much higher interest rate. We have tightening by key central banks, and we have capital reversals from developing and emerging markets. So the context have massively changed, and at the same time, the whole world has been prone to a tsunami of global shocks. So the needs have massively increased, but the sources of financing are dwindling. So that leads to the issue that there is no escape for the need of actually consolidation. This is the reality that we'll have to go through. The issue is, how do we actually do it in a way that does not lead to more socio-political instability in the region? And here comes the issue of the quality of this consolidation. You want to make sure that you ring fence the social safety nets, improve the targeting of the social safety net programs, enhance the efficiency of the spending. In many countries, this has been part of the problem of how things got there. And there is no escape of doing it. And it's going to be very country specific. So, in Tunisia, for example, we have a huge issue with the size of the wage bill. A key issue would be needing to do a civil service reform. You have also a lot of issues with state-owned enterprises in a number of countries. I remember a few years ago, I did like a piece on state-owned enterprise in Tunisia. There were 105 state-owned enterprises across all sectors, including in things that are like not even in tobacco. You would not expect. Yeah, exactly. So there are many issues that will need to be really handled. Going forward then, in this current environment, what needs to be done? So one is, I think it depends on where the country is. So there are countries that are already in debt distress. They'll have to go through debt restructuring. They'll have to, find the, solutions and so on to get out. But there are the countries that are actually not there yet. There need to be basically the tools to actually reduce the cost of financing. And I think related to this is work that we have been doing in ECA through a high-level working group on global financial architecture with the African Ministers of Finance, which actually include 4 countries out of the 6. And we've been actually advocating for a number of changes. Some of them are related to, things at the IMF, for example, and which actually affect 2 of these countries, issues of waiving surcharges. So if these countries number of them will need IMF programs. The current design, actually, because of the size of the financing that they will need, they will, it will significantly increase the cost of their financing because of that. For example, for Egypt, it's almost leads to double the cost because of this, double of the cost of servicing that debt, according to the calculation, if that surcharges, if they reach the level by which these charges apply. So this has been one of the asks, but also there were a number of other things that relate to the current architecture. So, the eligibility for G20 common framework. Middle income countries are not currently eligible. You need to have tools that actually enable you to handle the issue before you hit the wall. You need to have eligibility or application, upon application of a G20 common framework, that you have a debt standstill. Yeah. So there is actually a framework by which actually you can see some sort of a time-bound process that encourages countries to get in, but also there is increasingly more interest across African countries, including also in Egypt, to look into instruments such as debt for climate swaps, right, green finance, and there is huge potential for the continent to do more of that, but we need to have the international mechanism to support it, meaning a lot of the cases that have been done so far have been for small countries. Mainly, a lot of the finance or the concessional elements came from NGOs. To bring it to scale, you need this to be supported at a higher level. Perhaps one of the things that we also put forward in the discussion with ministers and later on in discussion with management is the issue of thinking about the RST tool at the IMF as a catalyst, and sustainability exactly, funds, yeah, as a catalyst, how it can be as a catalyst to actually bring further green finance, right, either through innovative products or through this debt for climate swaps, a sort of like guarantees, credit enhancement elements that would be much needed. I can talk more, but I know I want to make sure
absolutely. That. No, I mean, this is super. You took us from the local to the global, which is where I wanted to take Masoud Ahmed. Thanks for being with us. First time I met you, you were my director of research in the research department of the World Bank long time ago. And then you moved through the whole world, right? To the IMF, to England, to DFID, right? And now you have your hands on the core global issues that Hanan talked about at the Center for Global Development, where you have an amazing program. The same way the Middle East Institute has an amazing program on the Middle East. So what would you want to say to respond to Hanan in terms of what the changes in the global architecture that are needed for the Middle East to also help itself out of the tough place in which it is, and how come we don't hear enough the Middle East voice, right, in those global debates where you're a central actor?
Thank you very much, Isaac. And we've had some really insightful interventions. So I'm going to be very brief and just pick up on 3 points, some of which are just picking up on what others have said. First thing I think it's worth saying, though, is just take a minute to think about what the world is going to look like over the next 2 years, because it's in that context that we'll be doing this conversation. And basically, this is a bad year. Next year will be worse. And we're going to have continued high inflation. Everyone's focus will be in the advanced economies on bringing inflation down. That's going to be #1 priority. So they're going to keep interest rates high. Financial markets will therefore not be very open to emerging markets. And growth's going to come down. There'll be recession in Europe. There'll probably be recession in the US. China's going to slow down a lot. So that's the big picture within which we're going to be looking at the Middle East for the next 2 years. What does that mean? I think it means for me is be realistic in terms of what you can get done. Europeans in particular are going to be very much focused on energy security for themselves It's going to have a harsh winter, it'll be a worse winter next year for them. Their focus will be on Ukraine and the East. So we have to be realistic and we have to be opportunistic. And I think there are two areas of international debate which are going to move forward in the next 2 years. And that's where both of them are relevant for the Middle East. First is going to be around climate change, renewable energy, green finance. The IMF's got an RST, the Resilient Sustainability Trust. We're going to have half a dozen countries done by February. I'm not sure there are any Middle Eastern countries in the current list that I see. Maybe there'll be one. I think World Bank is going to be shifting a lot of its energy and the MDBs onto green finance, on climate change, on what they can do to mobilize private money through guarantees and the like for climate. So I would say, really this is an opportunity where if you want to push for trying to see some agenda for growth in the near term, put a lot of energy behind that. Second area is going to be debt. Debt we all talk about a lot. I spent a lot of my life worrying about debt issues and debt framework. Basically, we talk, but we don't act. The bottom line is every 6 months we have ever more articulate presentations of how dire the problem is and how urgent it is to resolve the issue and what needs to be done to resolve the issue. But basically, for political reasons, we're not able to bring together the official creditors, which include China and Paris Club and official agencies in a way that they can work together. And private creditors also have not been very forthcoming. So far, we've had these 3 countries that have been going through one framework, which is this G20 common framework. You have a few countries that are outside the framework that are trying to find individual solutions. I'm not convinced that there's going to be a huge change in the framework in the next 2 years. So my advice to countries would be, if you've got a debt problem like Lebanon or Sudan does, you're already in the middle of it, you're trying to deal with it. But if you haven't yet, and I think Egypt and Tunisia are the two that are the most furthest out there in the region, with sort of Jordan a little bit further behind, I would say, think now about what is the strategy that you want to have to manage the debt issue. And I'm not sure. I mean, there are people who are much more involved with the countries than I am, but don't assume that it'll get taken care of. I think you need a much more proactive game plan on what you're going to do. And the most important thing about it is don't make random comments about your debt. I think the thing that really hurts a lot of countries, and I speak in a broad definition of the region for this, is when you have policymakers coming forward and making comments about it'd be a really good idea to get debt forgiveness or debt restructuring, because all it does is that it spooks the markets, pushes up your spreads, and does zero for getting you debt forgiveness or debt restructuring. It has no impact on your objective. It only increases your cost. So I think exchange rates and debt are 2 issues on which my personal view is, less said the better unless you've got a game plan. And the final, so I would say on that, you could move forward. The last thing I want to say in 1 minute is, Mustafa very rightly pointed out that, politicians don't act on structural reform sometimes because they're not quite sure about the link between those reforms and growth. And even the term structural reforms, what does it mean to anybody? It's very abstract. But sometimes, and I think more often than perhaps we'd like to admit, the reason politicians don't act is because the current low growth equilibrium in which many of the countries of our region are stuck is actually a pretty good equilibrium for the elite. So the elite actually doing quite well in this equilibrium. The things that you need to do, and some of them I think you do know what needs to be done. A country like Pakistan, for example, the same applies to many countries in the region. You've got public enterprises, the big loss makers. You know what to do about them, but it's very hard to tackle them. You've got tax to GDP ratios that are low because very few people are in the tax space. You know how to bring more people into it, but they're actually politically quite important people. or you've got state enterprises in Egypt that sort of crowd out private enterprises and don't create competition. So I think the real question, which it would be great for the Commission to ask, to focus on next, is not just the how of what needs to be done, but also how do you shift from the current low growth equilibrium that actually suits the elite. And there's a little bit, some of you may have been following Stefan Durkheim's recent book, which is about the elite bargain, which is sort of formalizes this point a bit, that of saying that you really only move when the elite in a country are convinced that it's in their interest to move forward. And I'm not convinced that in many of our countries in the region, we have reached the point where there is that commitment to tackle the constraints to move forward. And of course, the harder the macro, the fund really can only do macro in the end. The harder the macro, the more difficult it is to focus on these things, because your whole attention gets shifted on short-term firefighting. And I think our finance ministers spend way too much time firefighting and balancing their books, and therefore not enough time on really thinking through a growth strategy. So let me stop with that, Isaac.
Thank you, Masoud. This is all very thoughtful. And indeed, for most of us that have been working for years and decades on the Middle East, this has been the situation. The liberalization of the 80s has been a very unbalanced liberalization that quickly led to an environment in which they were pretty comfortable, with big businesses with privileges that they were allied with. But then came the Arab Spring in 2011, and then came a decade of chaos. And now we are at a situation where this model is unsustainable, is about to explode financially. That's what this report is saying. And the question now is whether these regimes can understand that way of doing business is not going to be available in the future. This low equilibrium will have to become a very low equilibrium, a la Lebanon, literally, for if no change happens. And so we're back maybe with a concluding thought, because I saw you were trying to think again about how civil society, perhaps in Tunisia, could mobilize to put pressure actually for politicians to think harder by themselves. And you don't need a blueprint to move. You need to put a process together that finds a solution, right? You need to focus on how to get out of this trap.
Ishaq, I am known for being rather pessimist. Okay, because I see things the way they are really, and not try to. Now, you ask me why there is no pressure on politicians to move in the right direction. Well, I tell you, there is a lot of pressure on politicians to do things. But unfortunately for you and for me, they're not the ones that you think are the right things to do. The pressures that the politicians face are to do things that you think they should not do. Politicians in Tunisia today for the last 10 years, and I have said this to my old friend Shanta Devarajan, who was in the MENA region chief economist, and he tried to sell this idea of the new social contract. And the new social contract that he likes himself, that he has developed in the bank, that says, okay, we don't want the government to be on our backs politically. We want to be free, but at the same time, we're going to free the economy. Okay, we're going to eliminate subsidies. We're going to have, competition and so on. But the people don't like that. They don't like to take away the subsidies. Nobody in the political arena will be pushing for eliminating the subsidies. Very few people actually will dare, say that. And politicians and political parties, even the opposition, will come and say we eliminate subsidies. Very little, very few people. Very few will come and say, okay, public SOEs were loss making and so on. Let's get rid of them or something.
So we economists should be talking to the opposition before talking to the rulers.
Exactly.
Very good.
Because there is no social consensus on what needs to be done really on this. That's why these debates, have to be really deep and have to be thoughtful and have to be long-term, as Jihad said. I mean, I agree. It's not something that you can do it very quickly. Tunisia, this has not been happening. This has not taken place. I tried in 2016. 2016, it was after there was the new constitution and there was a new government, you were expecting maybe we are going to take a good path and so on. So at that time, we organized, as economists, organized a conference. We called it the fundamental economic and social choices for the country. And we had working papers on different issues on the state and bureaucracy, the public sector, the public enterprises, on this and that and so on. And we had this, and we tried to bring the politicians. Some politicians came, but most did not. Starting with the government itself. The government undermined and the labor union undermined what we are trying to do. Even though they were invited to get into this debate as labor union, but the labor union in Tunisia did not like that. Did not like that we posed these issues outside. So it failed, this experiment. We tried exactly to do this. Okay, there was a window of opportunity for us. At the time we saw there was a window of opportunity to get a debate on these long-term issues, on these basic choices. How do we like the private sector to be? What kind of private sector we want? What kind of public sector we want?
Right.
What kind of social contract we want, really. We wanted to open these discussions. And now I think since 2006, I think the situation has gotten worse. There is even less debate
16.
about this. 16 up to now, 6 years.
Yeah.
The debate has even gone worse. It's now we discuss, other, strange ideas about, I mean, I don't want to get too much into these details, but it's very difficult. I mean, politically, I mean, what the commission, I support fully what the commission is trying to say in terms of the need for that. But how to go and do it actually is really very, very difficult.
It has to be country by country, and I think that's your next step.
Yes,
That's the next step, very much so. Yeah. And I think that's also the period where the region is. 2011, there was a sense in civil society that one could jump from hell to paradise. And somehow civil society has grown out of this. And it seems to me should be more ready than in 2016 to focus on more realistic debates on actual issues and reforms that need to be discussed, as opposed to how to, what kind of paradise it wants. And possibly the private sector could be more ready because, the big cronies have learned their lesson. They end up mostly expropriated and in jail. The rule of law should be much better for them. So, hopefully we are moving to a place where social coordination among actors for kind of win-win deals, as opposed to Shanta's type of social bargains, would be possible. And I hope, just to conclude, that the international organization would keep pushing for more social debates and would make that offer more serious, actually, and more constraining. And more importantly, I think it's really on us, civil societies in the region, to actually push for this to happen, because it has to start inside. We took a few more minutes than planned. Thank you for being here. This has been super. And thanks, Paul, for hosting us.